Okay. Okay, we're finally live. Can everyone hear me?
Yep,
So let me just get
I can hear you.
Okay, you guys can hear me. Chat, can you hear me? Everyone rolling in now. It's getting out of hand. Now there are three of them. Okay, so what I was saying before it was cut off in the last stream, which I'm going to delete. I'm going to paraphrase. We're joined by the glorious Alan Dean Foster, who has written many books, and we gave a big introduction to him yesterday as well. But essentially, he's written A New Hope. He's written Splinter, The Mind's Eye, the Force Awakens novel, Approaching Storm, which was a prequel novel, and many, many more books. Once again, hello, sir. How you doing? Thank you for your time. And I'm joined by Mark, and we're going to make this interview happen. Now everyone's rolling in. We can hear you. Okay, so we're good. Cool. So what I was saying before... No, I didn't delete it.
The other one?
No, it's still up for the next hour, and I'm just going to focus on our conversation right now because I don't want to be derailed anymore.
All right. Because half the people are probably still there. He's going, what's going on?
No, it's closed.
All right.
Yeah, they're like, where are they? Yeah. Okay, so what I was asking was, with A New Hope, when you were writing the novelization, the prologue with the wills was something that I found interesting, and I always wanted to learn more about the wills. I feel like that's what maybe the sequel trilogy would have been about with George. I know there are many different rumors about that. Can you tell me about what you know about the wills from George from the beginning?
That's what was in the script that I was given.
Okay.
Part of it, I expanded on it like I did everything else in the screenplay for the book. I always thought, and I never had a chance to ask George or anybody else about this, and it was never confirmed by any other source. I always thought the wills would be, assuming there would be a sequel, because no one thought at the time that there was any guarantee of any kind of a sequel.
Yeah.
I always thought if the wills were a real thing in the Star Wars universe, as small as it was at the time, there would be some ancient overseeing race that just kept track of things. They were historians, in other words. So they wouldn't interact directly with anything that was going on because the job of their species was to record things as accurately as possible for future species. And that was it as far as I was concerned with the wills. I thought it was a fascinating idea.
Yeah.
It never got explored. The other possibility, of course, would be that the wills would be something like what I just described, but that they would have interactions with what was going on in the Star Wars universe. And there was always this thought that they were not prime movers behind the scenes, but maybe just out of personal willish interest, they might tweak a little something here and there, and this person might get saved mysteriously, and this person might step off a cliff mysteriously, and that they were kind of acting in the background in small ways. Because if you made them major actors in Star Wars, then the whole storyline would have taken a completely different approach. But it would have been fun to see them kind of in the background a little bit. When I first encountered the character of Maz Kanata, I had this weird thought that maybe she's actually a will.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting thought.
Yeah, because I don't know who she is, and I thought maybe she's a Yoda species or something. Maybe there's those ears are being pushed in by whatever she's wearing, but.
Well, there were a lot of possibilities. It's nice to have some mysteries. You don't want everything spelled out.
Right.
I was asked another time in another interview, which character would I like to explore more if I was writing additionally in the Star Wars universe? And the answer would be Maz Kanata, because we don't know a whole lot about her. It's nice to have that little bit of mystery in the background there. And I would try to keep her that way too. So I never actually thought she was a will, but maybe she had some contact with the wills, or she was an intermediary with the wills. Because you don't want everything spelled out. And if we learn who the wills are, what their exact purpose is, what they look like, then the mystery all goes away. And I think that takes some of the fun out of it. There are enough things in Star Wars that are spelled out in various encyclopedias as well as the films, to where we don't need everything spelled out.
Everyone's got a backstory character.
Backstory. Yeah, that was my take on the wills.
So let's take this back to the beginning. Can you share with us how you remember the first time that you heard the name George Lucas, that you met, whether it was through a phone call or whatever, the first time you interacted with George Lucas?
I had a book come out called Ice River, which did very well. And apparently, and I never had this confirmed anywhere, apparently someone connected or several someone's connected with Star Wars thought that the book was in the same spirit as the film that George was making. And on the basis of that and the fact that I had already done some novelizations for Ballantine Books Del Rey, thought I might be a good person to do the book version of this upcoming film. And my editor at the time, Judy Lindell Ray, called and discussed it with me and said, "Have you ever heard of a filmmaker named George Lucas?" And I said, "Sure." He made a good science fiction film, THX 1138, which was an expansion of a graduate student film. And then he made, of course, American Graffiti. So that's how I knew the name George Lucas. And she said to me, "Well, he's making this science fiction film called Star Wars." And I immediately went, "Oh boy, it's a Flash Gordon takeoff or something," not knowing of George's interest in Flash Gordon at the time. But it'll be Poe, but that's okay. And I said, "Sure, I'd be interested in doing the book." So I was sent to meet with Del Rey proposed my name as the prospective author of the book version. I was sent to meet with George's lawyer, Tom Pollock, over on Hollywood Boulevard, which we did, presumably to size me up and ascertain the fact that I wasn't a secret axe murderer or something. And on the basis of that, I was asked to go out and meet with George at Industrial Light and Magic, which at that time was in a rented warehouse in Van Nuys, California, about 10 minutes from where I grew up. So I knew exactly where it was. I went over there one day, couldn't find a place to park because the entire parking lot was filled with large pieces of plywood mounted on sawhorses, on top of which were all these little plastic building looking things. These were all the pieces for the Death Star trench run. They were so big that they didn't have room inside the warehouse, so they put them out in the parking lot. This being Southern California, the weather was fine. So I walked in and met with somebody, and they said, "Well, tell George you're here." And I said, "What should I do in the meantime?" And she said, "Well, just wander around, do whatever you want. Just try not to touch anything," which I knew well enough not to do anyway. So I'm walking around Industrial Light and Magic. I did not have a camera, but would not have taken pictures anyway. No cell phone cameras back in those days. No cell phones back in those days. We had wind-up telephones. You remember those. And wandered around and looked at everything, and there was a whole wall piled up to the top with plastic model kits from World War II battleships and fighter jets, all of which were being cannibalized to make the models. And finally had this one guy call me over and say, "You want to see something interesting?" So I said, "Sure," wondering where George was. And he said, "This is the first computer-controlled camera in the history of motion pictures." And John Dykstra proceeded to explain Dykstra vision to me, none of which I was interested in at the time because I was young and stupid. And eventually George came out and, we shook hands, and he said, "Let me show you around a little bit. And here's the Death Star, which is this beach ball size thing. And here's an X-Wing fighter. It was mounted on a gimbal in front of a green screen, one of the original models, of course." And we chatted for a bit, and I guess he decided I was okay, because I ended up doing that and the first sequel book. There was a 2-book contract. And that was my contact with George Lucas at the very beginning. He was very nice. He struck me as a fan who was making a movie. And he probably struck me as a writer who at least was competent at doing this sort of work. And we hit it off very well. I didn't press him on questions. I didn't try to make the interview last for 2 hours or something, because having been around the motion picture business for a while, my uncle Howie Horowitz produced Batman on TV and 77 Sunset Strip and other shows. I had some inkling of what making a motion picture involves, never mind one with complicated special effects. And frankly, I was surprised he had any time to give to me at all. But it was nice. It was fun. He struck me as the least likely guy to be a major filmmaker as anybody could possibly imagine. He was just a nice guy making a movie.
This is so cool. It's like taking me down memory lane.
Later on, if you want me to go
please,
this.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
starstruck with the stories.
Yeah, we want to go back and really explore the beginning, and how all of the original philosophy originated, which we've since deviated from, in my opinion, quite drastically.
Very.
Yeah.
But yeah, so did you guys have any of those moments where you sat down after you had read the script and talked about how you were thinking about expanding the narrative or stuff like that, or did you have any work sessions?
In one session involving Splinter the Mind's Eye, just remember it was a 2-book contract. As soon as I finished the adaptation of the film, I dove into developing a storyline for the proposed sequel, came up with the title, Splinter the Mind's Eye, sent it off to George and his people, came back, said fine, and I went ahead and wrote the book. And the next time I saw George was at a meeting in a small rented building on the Universal lot in one of what they called the bungalows, which were buildings that probably dated to late World War II or post World War II era. It was myself, Gary Kurtz, and Charlie Lippincott, who was in charge of advertising and promotion. The 4 of us sat down and had a session about Splinter the Mind's Eye. The first thing we discussed was the adaptation of Star Wars. And George said, I read the book, it's fine. Doesn't work like that anymore.
Yeah.
But that, that's how that finished up. And then it was time to discuss Splinter. And he knew how Star Wars was going to proceed and end. He was more concerned at that point about Splinter because it was entirely new material that I had come up with. So we talked. There were certain things. He had already seen the manuscript for the book at that point. And he said, the book's fine, but there are 2 things you need to take out, please. One, I don't remember, but it was very small. The other was the fact that Splinter originally opened, for fans who remember the book, with a very large space battle. It was the entire first chapter. This is what forces Luke and Leia, who are in the area, if you will, down on the planet Mimban.
Yeah.
And George said, you have to take that out, please, because it'd be expensive to film. And the whole point of Splinter was to write something which could, in a pinch, be filmed on a low budget, which is why Splinter is set on a fog-shrouded planet and often is underground. These are cheap sets. There's no CGI back in those days. So I developed the story with that always in mind, but the opening space battle, which doesn't really add anything enormous to the story, it's just a really nice space battle, was gone, and essentially the book opens with chapter 2. Other than that, there were no concerns or complaints. George had some suggestions. All of this is documented, by the way, in recordings that the prescient Charlie Lippincott made for all of these kinds of story sessions. And there's a lot of talk back in there if you ever get a chance to read them or listen to them. George suggesting certain things, me diplomatically trying to suggest that maybe that's not a good idea, Gary Kurtz putting his opinion in. Gary and I tended to agree on a lot of the story elements, not only for Splinter, but whenever any idea of future Star Wars were discussed, we were pretty much in line. George liked to wander a little bit, not so much because he couldn't focus on the story, but he always had these other ideas that he wanted to incorporate. There's the story of him wanting to have in Star Wars, of course, a big battle where you have Wookiees mounted on giant creatures attacking. Could we fit that in Splinter? I delicately tried to say, no, it didn't really go with the storyline that had been developed. Stuff like that at the time, of course, was simply story talk.
Yeah.
There was a notion that there was going to be a second Star Wars film. And what happened, of course, was that when Star Wars became an enormous success, George no longer had to make a sequel or sequels on a low budget, could do whatever he wanted, and we got The Empire Strikes Back, which I thought was a marvelous film.
Did you guys ever talk about, because I know you wrote Approaching Storm, did you guys ever talk about the prequels?
No, never talked about the prequels. After the novelization came out and after Splinter came out and after both of them sold millions of copies, and Star Wars fandom became a developing thing. Del Rey, which had the rights to do Star Wars books, would periodically ask me if I wanted to do an original Star Wars novel.
Hmm.
Of course, I was familiar with Brian Daley's books and others, and I just didn't want to do that. I didn't want to do a book about Chewbacca's third cousin's uncle. I just didn't want to do it. It wasn't even that I couldn't get up. I couldn't get my creative juices flowing to do something like that.
Yeah.
It just didn't interest me.
Yeah.
I had my own original work to do. I had other film franchises that I was involved with. And then eventually Del Rey came down, and Julian Del Rey was a real powerhouse of an editor. She could be very persuasive. And she said, well, we have another project, Star Wars project, we think might interest you. And I kind of rolled my eyes and said, how do I diplomatically decline? And she said, we'd like you to write one of two proposed sequel books that fits between episode 1 and 2 and actually fits in that narrative. In other words, it's not somebody off on a spice run somewhere on the other side of the Star Wars galaxy. And I thought that could be really interesting. The other thing was it involved a female Jedi, which I had Luminara and Dooley, and also her female Padawan, Barriss Offee. And I thought, this is something that nobody's done yet. It's something that's always interested me about Star Wars. And I could explore, I would have interesting things to explore here if they'll let me do it. So I said yes, and that's the book that became The Approaching Storm. And I also got to deal with young Anakin. I enjoyed writing that book. I was largely left alone to write what I wanted to. However, there was a story conference up at the Skywalker Ranch where it was no longer myself and the director and the producer and Charlie Lippincott. It was a panel of people. And it was at about this point where they started going over every little tiny thing to make sure it accorded with a developing Star Wars universe chronology and encyclopedia. So it was not nearly as enjoyable as writing the first two books, but it was okay. It wasn't terrible. And I did get to write basically the book I wanted to write.
And to that point about this kind of relationship between the extended universe back then and the sort of the core canon films, were there a lot of guidelines that you would be given? Were there a lot of boundaries set up for you in these kind of conversations with these groups?
Not so much, no. It was essentially, I would propose, in the case of Approaching Storm, I proposed my idea, they okayed the idea, and I went and wrote it, and then we had the conference where it got picked at. And I honestly couldn't go back and tell you what was specifically requested to be removed and what they wished to add, but it was nothing I couldn't accommodate. I can work with other people on books and films. I prefer as a writer to work alone, but that's not the way the motion picture business works. But it was nothing major. It was just additional work. And so I did it.
When you were writing the original Star Wars novel, or ghost writing as is famously referred to, at this point, did you already know, or did George already know that that Anakin was Darth Vader and Luke's father? Because there's always a lot of conversation that George didn't actually know that decision until they were basically in production on Empire Strikes Back. But as you're writing the novel and hearing about Obi-Wan talking about, Luke's father and all of this stuff, did you already know this amazing dynamic that would become what's my favorite character in all of pretty much history, that the Anakin Darth Vader connection? Did you guys already discuss that?
Didn't have a clue, was never mentioned. Was never, so you can draw your own conclusions, as fans have been doing for a very long time. What I always wanted to see was, because you do have that line from Obi-Wan about Luke's father, I always wanted to see Darth Vader as Luke's evil older brother, who actually did kill their father, but has been covering it up all along and pretends to be Luke's father. And that would make Darth Vader even more of a bad guy. Of course, then you can't redeem Darth Vader at the end by having him on his deathbed saying, "I'm sorry, I killed 12 billion people. Please forgive me."
Including some younglings and
couldn't do that. But that's the course I wanted to see Darth Vader go. But it's not my universe.
Yeah.
It was George's universe, and with George's characters and George's invention, and that's the way it should go. And I didn't feel it was my place as simply the writer of the book adaptation to make proposals about future films other than anything I'd already done that existed in Splinter. But that's what I've done. But no, to answer your question, there was no clue, there was no indication. Just like there was no indication at that time that Luke and Leia were brother and sister.
Yeah.
That was also, I'm sure that was, because we have evidence of it, a decision that was made while Empire was being developed and made.
And so, we're talking about Anakin's redemption, Vader's redemption, after killing 12 trillion people or whatever it was. Concluding Return of the Jedi, did George ever talk with you, or did you have any insight on what his sequels would have been like?
I had no idea. It was never asked. I'm not pushy enough.
Yeah.
I can be actually more pushy as a fan than as a writer. Again, not my universe. I would have been delighted to contribute.
Yeah.
But it wasn't there. And again, I don't move in those circles. I live in central Arizona.
Yeah.
I go to parties. I'm not nice to people I don't have to be nice to. Whatever you want to make of that, I will interject myself if the situation allows. But to sit around writing letters saying, "Please, can I work on Return of the Jedi?" or "Please, can I work on this or work on that?" I just don't do that. People know where I am.
Yeah.
If they want my input or any thoughts from me, I'm happy to provide them.
Yeah. And Theory, you had a really interesting point when you and I were riffing yesterday about Splinter: The Mind's Eye with the crystal.
The crystal.
Ask him a little bit about
Yeah, I'd love to learn more about the crystal that basically amplifies your power, tenfold, and allowed Vader to shoot Force lightning, and because that's something that constantly we're told that Vader can't do because of his cybernetics and the way Sidious built his suit and this and that. So, was that something that you talked about with George? Was that something he ever touched on? Or was that just something that you wanted to see and you created?
Yeah, that was something I wanted to see, and I spelled it the way I did because I didn't want there to be any confusion with the Kyber Pass in Afghanistan.
Okay.
Which is spelled Kyber. And I thought, well, you can call it the Kyber Crystal, but change the spelling. I thought it would be interesting if there was a device, a gimmick, which could magnify Force powers. That allowed me to bring in the character of Hala, who's, you could call her almost a progenitor in some ways of Maz Kanata. I don't know how these things filter through, but they do sometimes, and that doesn't bother me. It's all part of the universe. But I just thought it would be fun to have a device or something like that in there. I think it's kind of fun the way they developed the use of the crystal in lightsabers. If you're going to have a silly weapon, you might as well have a silly crystal in it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if I'm spitting in somebody's holy water here, but that's
mine. But it's okay.
Really?
You always get a straight answer from me, a straight opinion.
I love that.
Yeah, I like that. There's no dancing.
Every once in a while, when I'm writing a book, I'll have particularly a film novelization, I'll have a bad attack of what the hell. And I'll just throw something in there just for fun. You wouldn't believe, or maybe you would believe, how many queries I get about the Wyatt Duck reference in Star Wars in the book. Well, by the same token, there's an idol in Splinter: The Mind's Eye, which might slightly resemble a character from somebody else's universe. And fans pick up on it, fans of both. I'm referring, of course, to our old friend Cthulhu. Fans pick up on that, but why shouldn't he exist in the Star Wars universe as well as, it's universe-spanning characters anyway, Lovecraftian characters. So I threw that in there, and nobody picked up on it related to the film or the publisher or anything else, but fans of both Lovecraft and Star Wars recognize it immediately. Fun things like that I like to throw in there for fans to discover. It just can't be too blatant, because then sour-looking people in the accounting department come and give you this
Ah,
You can't. Why are you doing this? You can't do this.
this won't make us money.
No, I have to explain that writing has to be fun for the writer too.
Yeah.
Mm. So let's pass some of the kind of beginning stuff and get a little deeper into a little bit of the darker stuff. At least from my perspective as a fan, the story that I've always heard is that Michael Arndt and George Lucas developed a screenplay for Episode 7, and that screenplay was then taken and changed quite a bit by Lawrence Kasdan and J.J. Abrams and others, and we get what we got with The Force Awakens. And I'm fascinated because you're in a position, having written the novelization of The Force Awakens, just to ask you bluntly, did you ever read the unadulterated version of Michael Arndt's script for Episode 7?
No, I never saw it. Why would the studio send me reference materials that don't reference what I'm actually doing? There was no reason for me to see it. I would love to have seen it. I love seeing stuff like that.
Yeah.
Just like William Gibson's script for Alien. Alien 3. But no, I never saw that. I worked only from the material I was given. The screenplay I was given, plus some visuals, which is what I always work from. And that's all I had. I thought the script was very good. I thought there were some interesting things in there, which I tried to develop. Some other things I tried to change. Little things that I thought would make it read more like science fiction rather than science fantasy. I'm always doing that with Star Wars, even though I know it's science fantasy. I can't help myself. Some of the things they made me take out. I didn't have to go to a story conference. This was all done via email. And some things I couldn't understand why they would want me to take them out. I thought they were good and I thought they added to the story. The main thing they left in, which I was sure they would take out, was my fixing the Starkiller weapon, which was, apologies to the original writers, really silly.
It was.
I mean, not to go on and on about that, although it's a particular thing of mine, obviously.
Oh no, let's go on.
Please do go on. No, I
can't. The physics on that are a disaster.
Look, let me just we both share the same sentiment that we're very confused by the sequels in general. We don't understand how it strayed so far from George's vision, and frankly, as fans, we're a bit insulted as to how they would present us this kind of a storyline that was so fragmented and wasn't linear in any sort of way. And then, hearing the actors talk about how they didn't even know what their lineage was or this and that. Which takes me to my next. Please go ahead.
No. First, I'll address your comment first.
When
go back to that for a minute.
Okay, yeah. When you were writing, two questions, I guess, basically. When you were writing for Rey, did they tell you who her lineage was at all? Because she said Daisy Ridley was saying something about Obi-Wan, and then she said it's Palpatine, and then.
No idea, and I don't think they had an idea either. They might have had some thoughts, bearing in mind that there would be further films, but if so, none of that was ever communicated to me. So I had to invent a background for her insofar as I could. And no, I didn't make Rey a droid. I'll explain that too if you want.
What was the background that you gave her in your mind when you were writing?
She'd been abandoned on the planet. She obviously had some force powers. I didn't think she was connected at that point to the Skywalkers in any way, which I thought made her a more interesting character.
Right.
Because if we're going to do family drama, we do The Crown, and that's not what I ever thought Star Wars was. So I had to develop a background for her, and also for how she accumulated the ability to do these amazing things in seemingly a blink of an eye, all of which I tried to explain in the book as close as I could in ways that I thought they would let me leave in. To your previous comment, the reason a lot of these things happen, and this is just my personal opinion, is because people who try to go into the film business know they can't set the lights, they know they can't operate the camera, they know they can't do the special effects, or sew the costumes, or do the editing, but everybody thinks they can write. And so that's why we get some of the things not just with Star Wars, obviously, but in many films, some of the things we do that don't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And if you throw science into the mix, you get real problems. And that's
Mm.
why we always have to refer to Star Wars as science fantasy and not science fiction.
Yeah. So just to
Going,
go back to, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish up.
going back to the Star Killer weapon, if you had
Yes.
something that could draw down pieces of a star, you obviously have more power available to yourself than you need to draw down stuff from a star. And if you could do that, it would immediately, the heat would blow all the air off the planet, and everybody and everything would die instantly, and your film would come to a sudden stop.
Mhm.
So I set myself the task for that one little piece of science in The Force Awakens to research possible ways, theoretically, using real physics and real astrophysics to blow up a planet. And I came up with something that involves terms, as physicists like to use, that sound really silly, but are actual real physics. And put them all in there. And what my goal with that was to write something over a couple of pages that could be presented to somebody like Neil Tyson, and he wouldn't laugh at it. And I thought, sure, they would take that out. And they left it in.
Right. Surprisingly.
So I got well, there are probably a dozen people on the planet who actually understand the details of what I was writing about. I'm not one of them, but I can fake stuff pretty good after all these years.
Yeah.
And I figured nobody would challenge, I was hoping nobody would challenge it because they wouldn't admit to an inability to understand what I was saying. I think that maybe is what happened.
To stay on Star Killer base or that scene, there's like probably the most, in my opinion, in theory, please jump in here, the most kind of discussed moment in the novels, at least in my little circles of friends, is always that moment when Rey hears the voice,
Right.
in her head. So could you expand a little bit about that, about what you were thinking with that scene, or where that kind of came from?
Sure. It was in the script. So I adapted it for the book like everything else that was in the script. I didn't know exactly where the voice, it wasn't specified in the script where the voice came from. The only person, the only character in the story that I could think of, two characters, no, the only character in the story I could think of who would possibly say something like that or be related to a dream sequence like that would be Kylo Ren. And that's the way I wrote it. And I didn't go any further with that. I didn't say specifically, if I recall the book correctly, that Kylo Ren is doing that. But there's obviously a connection now between the two of them. Again, I didn't think of Rey as a Skywalker. I thought of her as so much more interesting to me if you introduce somebody who is not part of a lineage from the previous 6 films, who has these abilities, maybe a little different abilities. That to me was much more interesting. But it's not the way it played out. But as far as that particular sequence goes, and speaking from the standpoint of a writer, the only reason I could see for that to be included was to throw some kind of a MacGuffin in there, just something out of the blue that might intrigue viewers if they saw it on screen and subsequently read it in the book. If I'd been writing it, that scene wouldn't have been in there. Because once you put something like that in there, you have to explain what it's doing there. It has to have a purpose that is followed up on. And to me, as a writer, it was just confusing. But it certainly gave rise to a lot of fun speculation.
I always thought when she was, just about to strike down Kylo, when he was already on the ground, that voice that she hears that says, "Do it," was Snoke or Palpatine.
The nice thing about that was it could have been either of those, or it could have been anybody.
Okay.
And I just thought of when I was writing it, I just thought this is the dark side speaking to her.
Cool. Okay.
I didn't think of it as a particular person, a particular individual. I just thought that's the dark side speaking to her. That is the element of the dark side that is in her. And if she has that in her, then that makes her a much more ambivalent character morally and a much more interesting character. So there was no specific person in mind when I was writing that, just the dark side speaking.
I was making theories, trying to figure it out. I'm like, who could it be? It's Snoke. Did they tell you who Snoke was?
No.
Yeah. Yeah, what about Snoke? Like in terms of, did you ask? So who is this guy? Where did he come from?
The
What's
eye
his
roll.
thing? Like,
Yeah, he was such a cool character,
yeah,
and then the just
Of course,
nothing.
of course I did. And when I wrote my fun treatment for fans
Yeah.
for proposed episode 8, I dealt with Snoke. He was the emperor at the time. There was no Palpatine. Palpatine was gone.
yeah,
Palpatine was deaded, and I wish he'd stayed deaded.
yeah.
Nobody asks me.
Here.
So we have this new emperor who we find out is essentially unkillable until the end of the treatment that I did, because he has made clones of himself. I don't like clones. I don't like the idea of clones. I don't like the idea of. I think it's a cop out story wise, because then real people don't get killed.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the rationale for it. We're just killing the same person over and over again. But if Snoke has clones, I thought that would be an interesting way of preserving him. There's no Palpatine in my treatment because as far as I was concerned, Palpatine died. You keep bringing these old characters back. There has to be a real solid rationalization for it, and I never saw it.
Yeah.
Again, this is just me speaking. It's not my universe. But as speaking as a writer who's worked in this universe, I think it's much more interesting if you have new characters, like Maz Kanata, as a for instance, or Snoke.
Yeah.
I didn't like the name Snoke, but that's a minor quibble.
So we talked about Disney that it was George's vision and George was driving the vision. When you were working on Force Awakens after the Disney acquisition, who did you feel was driving the vision?
Now there's a loaded question.
Yes.
That's a Mark question, right? That's a good question.
Who did I feel was driving the vision? I didn't think anybody was driving the vision. I think it was a vision of groupthink. Just knowing how things. I don't know this. Maybe there was a Disney version of Hari Seldon sitting back there guiding everything secretly. But I think there was a lot of contributions from a lot of different places. And in the end, it's the writer and director who take ultimate responsibility for what you see. But I think there was a lot of input from sources who weren't as interested in writing as they were in preserving the fiscal legacy of Star Wars, which if I had paid several $billion for something and wanted my money back, I would consider a valid reason for having input. Rightly or wrongly from a creative standpoint. Again, I don't know that this was the case. Maybe Rian Johnson did everything and it was all his vision and nobody else had any input. But knowing what I know about the way the motion picture business works, especially large films done today, I suspect that was not the case. I would think there would have been a lot of story conferences that I was not privy to, where a lot of people had input, some of which was probably adopted, some of which was not. But in the end, it's the responsibility of the writer-director. It's your name on the screen or your name on the book, which is why I care about these things. I've been criticized for things over the years. You get good criticism, bad criticism, but ultimately it's my name on the book. And that's why I'm so passionate about what goes into it. It would be very easy to stand back and say, oh, you're right about that criticism there. That's a mistake or that's a bad piece of writing. But it's not my fault because it was in the screenplay or because it was in the movie. Can't do that. So I fight for certain things.
But needless to say that there was limited to zero input from George Lucas in the Force Awakens sequel.
I certainly didn't hear from George. I would have liked to have heard from George, even if he didn't have formal input into the screenplay and the finished product. Just to have heard from George, maybe it's a good thing I didn't. Because if I had heard from George and he'd said, well, this is actually the way I saw it 20 years ago. Can you put this in the book? I would have done my utmost to put it in the book, and I would put it in the manuscript, and then somebody likely would have said, wait a minute, this isn't part of this isn't in the screenplay, this isn't part of our idea, this isn't the storyline we want. And then I would have said, well, I talked to George, and this is his idea, And that would have put me in a very awkward place.
Mm.
And I don't mind being in awkward places, but when there's that much money involved and that much ego involved on all sides, I really try to stay away from it. I'm just this humble little writer sitting here in Central Arizona, trying to deliver the best story to people who plunk down their $20 for a book that I possibly can. It's one reason
Well
I
said.
live in Central Arizona, and we moved out of Los Angeles, not just because my wife said, sure you want to live here to be near these people. Sometimes distance is very important. There used to be, in the old heyday of the studios when they controlled everything, there would be a writer's building. And all the writers working on films had to come in and report and clock in and show that they were working on whatever project it was. And the studios would hire people in the early days of sound who were considered to be really good writers because the studio heads knew nothing about writing.
Mhm.
They knew movies, but they didn't know about writing. And one of the ones they hired was William Faulkner.
Mm.
And Faulkner finally said one day to whoever was supervising that part of the building, I can't really work here. Can I go work from home? And then I'll turn my stuff in. And the guy thought, and he said, sure. And time went by, and finally, I think if I'm remembering the story correctly, a senior supervisor came in and said, where's Faulkner? And the other guy said, well, he's working from home. Faulkner had gone back to Mississippi. He didn't want any part of Los Angeles or
Yeah.
that was the only way he could work. So I'm happy working where I work.
They say that Barton Fink is actually loosely based on that anecdote.
That's right.
That you're describing. This is fascinating to me. Theory, I know you had a few like other questions when we were riffing yesterday.
I could keep.
Force Awakens.
Yeah, I could keep going forever. But no, go for it, man.
Go ahead. No. You go.
Well, my question is, what did you think? What do you think of the sequel trilogy in general? Do you think, do you like it? Do you think it is straying from what George had intended, from your opinion, having been there from the very beginning? What would you like to see going forwards? Just as a fan.
Just as a fan?
Yeah, a fan and a writer, I suppose.
Off contract?
Yes.
I don't think I'm likely to be hired to work on the next film, so I think we're pretty safe here.
Okay.
Well, never say never. I mean,
who knows?
talent is talent.
I don't want you to
Talent
say
is
something that'll, who knows?
Things change rapidly in the motion picture business, but let's proceed on that basis. I thought episode 7 was pretty good. I thought JJ, doing sequels is really hard, and rebooting a franchise is even harder. And I thought he did a really good job. I thought he set up a lot of interesting things. We'll forget about the science. I did write about the science in the Force Awakens, by the way. Long 4-page letter, gave it to a supposed representative. As far as I know, it never got to it. It may have been ignored, don't know. I'm always making these unsolicited suggestions. So I thought episode 7 was pretty good. That's one reason I enjoyed writing the book, even though there were things they asked me to take out, but I expected that. I anticipated that. And I thought it set up a lot of interesting storylines for episode 8, proposed episode 8. I thought episode 8 was terrible. I've said this many times in print.
Yeah.
I think not to go on and on about it because people have ever since the film came
We've done
out.
that enough, Mark.
Yeah. We don't need to do it again, but yes. Yeah, we agree.
I thought it was a terrible Star Wars movie. And I thought it was just a bad movie, period. If you had never seen any previous Star Wars films and knew nothing about Star Wars, I still thought it was a bad movie. And there's no need to go on and on and on about why, because that's done ad infinitum. I thought episode 9 tried to fix and retcon as much as they could of episode 8. But when you blow up a house, rebuilding it out of only the material that's left from the initial explosion is really hard. I mean, pieces don't fit together.
Very well said.
Pieces don't fit together. A lot of the original construction material is irreparably damaged. I could not get that image of little puppet, little CGI Yoda dancing around like a refuge from the Muppets, while the tree burns and all the previous knowledge is destroyed. You can
Yeah.
reset things, you can reboot things. But if you're just going to piss on everything that goes before, including the hopes and desires of people who've grown up with the Star Wars films for their whole lives, never mind older fans, you're going to have a really tough time resetting. I am personally glad and hope that the Skywalker saga is done with. I think The Mandalorian is very nice. I think that's the direction Disney needs to go. The Star Wars universe is broad enough that they can go all kinds of different directions, especially since it's science fantasy and not science fiction, without going back and trying to fix and rehash what is a done deal. People have talked about, well, let's just remake episodes 8 and 9, 7, 2 if you want to, and forget about the others. You can't forget about the others. They're there, they exist. They're not going away any more than the pyramids are going away. We all have to live with that fact. But there's lots of fascinating directions that Star Wars can go. The Mandalorian being an excellent example. I don't think they should go back and try to do, my opinion again, Old Republic stuff or stories that exist in the timeline of the first 9 films but are outside it. I think they're much better off going into the future. Prequels are really hard to do because everything has to accord with something that already exists. Much rather see them do more stuff like The Mandalorian, which people are obviously having a good time with and enjoying.
I love it.
Yeah, go even further away from the original 9 films. Use the background, use the universe, use the technology, develop new things. And lo and behold, the Star Wars universe will continue in a way that fans enjoy. And they'll continue to argue about episodes 1 through 3 and episodes 7 through 9 till the end of time. But that's fine. That can be a separate.
To that point, what are your overall impressions from a similar perspective about the prequels or episodes 1 through 3?
I liked episode 3 a lot. I thought episodes 1 and 2 suffered from the thing that all prequels suffer from. We know what's going to happen. Eventually, we know what's going to happen to the storyline, to the major characters. It makes it extremely difficult. Plus, it makes it extremely difficult to engage people who, in the back of their minds, are thinking, well, I know what's going to happen to this character. You lose a lot of your tension, you lose a lot of your surprise, you lose a lot of your tools that you have as a writer to surprise and engage readers or viewers. I don't like prequels. I've done them myself on request, but they're hard, and I'd much rather do sequels than prequels or spin off in a different direction. If you go off in a different direction, that doesn't mean that you can't pull in things from your predecessor stories. Yeah. That's fun. Wait a minute. I saw so-and-so was wearing that gown in episode 2. Why is this character wearing it? It's exactly and fans love that sort of thing. I love that sort of thing. Yeah. But you don't have to develop a whole film or a whole book series around it. Just my take.
I agree.
Yeah. Look, that's fair. I would counter a little bit and say that the entire format of the tragedy, which was obviously extremely popular in the times of Shakespeare and in the Greek times, is sooner or later that the hubris will get the hero into a demise. So you're kind of always waiting for that to happen. And that's why, for me, the first 3 are really the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker. Obviously there's all this political stuff that's on top of it as well that I find very interesting. But, going with Anakin and, never wanting the end to come because it's coming, to me is actually a very powerful thing. But I agree with you that number 3 is my favorite Star Wars movie out of all of them. And 1 and 2 I've grown to love because they lead to 3. And also because 3 is the last George Lucas Star Wars movie we're ever going to get, so over the years, my rose-colored glasses have become more and more and more opaque, and I just see nothing but beauty. But I totally get your point. There was things in 3 that I wish could have happened that didn't happen, that maybe will happen now because of the television shows or whatnot. But look, it's a fair point, and I wanted to get your perspective, because sometimes people say, "Oh, you're always trashing the sequels." I think it's always important to give fair perspective to all of it, and as Star Wars fans, there's a lot of prequelists like me, and we got to check ourselves too at the door.
Fair enough.
Well, episode 2 had one of my favorite scenes in all of Star Wars, was when Anakin said goodbye to Padme and raced off to save his mother. We got the first glimpse of the dark side, which in the novel was... I wish they had incorporated so many pieces from the novel into the movie, because you got to see Anakin... Did you ever read the episode 2 novel, Alan?
No,
Well, essentially, you just get a whole bunch of force powers that Anakin uses on these Tusken Raiders, and he's just the dark side exemplified. It doesn't just cut to Yoda and Qui-Gon screaming, Anakin's using force speed, he's crushing the Tuskens with boulders, he's just going absolutely insane like a vampire in the night.
I was never a big fan of the Force.
Really?
I'm sorry. I mean, I love the idea of light and dark and all that.
Right.
As a writer, it lets you explore light and dark.
Sure.
But you reach a point where people become so powerful that it's hard to be sympathetic to them. And if everybody becomes Superman, then you end up with the Justice League and Marvel movies.
Right.
They're not human anymore. It's not humanized anymore. I thought Rey lost a lot of her humanness at the end of episode 8, because if you can just throw rocks and boulders and spaceships around, it's just it's hard to identify with characters like that. Yeah. It's hard to identify with any character who becomes a superhero, and the fewer weaknesses they have, the harder it is to sympathize with them.
Yeah,
it's tough for me, as a writer, to see where to go with something like, with an element, a story element like that. It's like, well, here we have this big confrontation. You just described some. And suddenly this character puts their hand up and everybody flies off into space. Okay, well, where does that go as a story? How do you develop the humanness of that character? My sympathy at that point, if you do something like that, is with all the dead people flying off into space. It's something that these movies do way too often, and I know why they do it, because it's a comic book kind of thing. But when you're killing dozens and hundreds and thousands of people, again, this goes back to the usefulness in this case of clones. It's like, presumably these people have families, they have kids, they have hopes, they have dreams. It was a one thing when I was criticizing, in a column I wrote criticizing episode 8, at the end where you have the Imperial Guards all being dispatched by Rey and Kylo fighting together, which is probably the best action scene in the entire film, actually. I actually have 2 of the guards staying back, and one of the guards, I forget what names I gave him, Bill and Ted or something like that, saying, wait a minute, to his buddy, because they presumably all know each other, and so, what are we doing here? And the buddy says, well, they just killed the Emperor, we have to. And the guy said, well, wait a minute, they just killed the Emperor. These 2 must be pretty powerful. And the Emperor's dead and we work for him. Why are we going to go get ourselves killed? I've got a vacation planned.
Right.
Take some time off. And these 2 are now obviously more powerful than the Emperor was, referring to Snoke at this point.
Yeah.
Says, why don't we see if we can go work for them?
Right.
It's like,
that's the common sense approach.
You've got human beings dying all the time, and they're still human beings. It's kind of like, there's no logic or reason to it. It just serves the plot. Like an Alien 3. Who are these prisoners on this prison planet? To switch
right.
a minute here. Why are they here? What did they do to get sent to this horrible, horrible place? But in the movie, they're just alien chow. Basically, they have no motivations or anything. As a writer, this concerns me.
Yeah.
I know in a 2-hour movie, you don't have time to explore everybody's backstory. But there at least should be some logic and reason to how these things happen. Or if people die, there should be consequences.
Well, I think
1000%.
my favorite part of this, of talking with you today, was when you enlightened us that everyone thinks that they're a writer, but they're not.
Right.
No, they're not.
I fancy myself a writer too, and sometimes I've done better than others.
See, everyone's a writer.
I can't paint worth a damn, so we'll just, I'm not taking anybody's cover art job away from them.
Right. That story is probably should have belonged at the beginning of the interview, but it's something that I actually learned back at NYU, and my professor probably told it in a strange way, but he credits the genius of Star Wars's initial explosion to this incredibly fascinating kind of grassroots marketing effort around Comic-Con a year before the movie came out, where George commissioned Ralph McQuarrie, I believe, to do the cover art for the novelization. And Ralph McQuarrie already had a pretty good name back then. And you had done the ghostwriting, and he was, the writer of record on the novel. And because it was a Ralph McQuarrie cover art, there was a huge line of people waiting to get, because Ralph McQuarrie was there at Comic-Con in the first one, to get his signature on this novelization of this book that nobody knew anything about. But that this kind of grassroots movement that started at Comic-Con, I believe in 76 or 75, it was like before the movie came out, was actually the reason why when the movie did come out, it already had this kind of built-in buzz. And they used this story for us as like kind of alternative marketing ideas and how to push your your film. Does this story ring a bell at all, or is this just complete fantasy that teachers tell students?
Oh, no. I mean, I don't know about the McQuarrie signing session personally, but we have to give a lot of credit to Charlie Lippincott, who I mentioned before, for this. Charlie's the one who developed this huge marketing campaign, got Star Wars into a newspaper as a comic strip, was responsible for arranging the toy licensing deals, which nobody wanted to do Star Wars toys. What's Star Wars? And in fact, Charlie came to me. We were talking one time and said, we've got a 16 millimeter reel of small things, little bits and pieces from the movie. He knew I was going to a couple of conventions, science fiction conventions. He said, would you take this and see if they'll show it? Which I did. They made me give the reel back, but so I did that. So all of this promotional stuff was, and the book deal too with Del Rey Books. To get the book out before 6 months before the movie came out. That's why the book was important to the film. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, any story you hear about promotion, pre-promotion for the film, probably eventually winds its way back to Charlie, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And Charlie saved everything. Charlie said he has boxes and boxes of stuff. The recordings I mentioned earlier of story sessions and other sessions.
Will those ever be released?
I don't know.
Private.
I don't know. His widow has control of that. But there's things like, script pages and set directions.
Oh,
and
wow.
tons and tons of stuff. Really belongs in a museum. But it only exists because he saved it. It's just like the Hollywood studios would reuse cells for cartoons because the acetate panels were worth more than the art that was on the panels. That's no longer true, of course, which is why the only studios that you find existing animation cells from early animation generally is Disney, because Disney did save and archive a lot of that stuff. Studios like Warner Brothers and MGM's animation and all of the others, they just washed the cells and reused them. Nobody thinks that something you do now is going to be history, but eventually everything that survives becomes history. So that's why people have learned this, and that's why they're starting to save things. So we have a lot of junk lying around that's not going to be important. But
I'd
who
love to
knows?
see it
2,000
someday.
years-
Yeah.
Yeah, 2,000 years down the line, all those McDonald's cups.
So we're pushing an hour already, and I want to be sensitive to your time, and you've been so generous with it, and I thank you so much for that. We've had the audience send in a few questions. I don't know if Theory, you want to pick a few of the audience questions to ask Alan.
Most of them are comments. Just we have over 3,000 people here right now that saying how much they love you and they appreciate you and they thank you for your work, and all your fans over here, and everyone's saying much love. Mr. Foster, thank you for all your writings. You've entertained us over the years. Many of us give you our full support. Just things like that. Nice messages. I have another question regarding the wills. I'm kind of
Let's do it.
very
Let's kind of bring it full circle.
Yeah. Well, you might not be able to answer, but in the Clone Wars, we get the Shaman of the Wills. Qui-Gon Jinn spoke to the Shaman of the Wills, and he was able to transcend into the Force, who taught Yoda, who taught Obi-Wan, so on and so forth, who taught Anakin. Do you know anything about the Clone Wars with the writing, or do you know if these wills were the actual wills from the original Star Wars, or?
That's a question for the people who wrote that episode.
Got it. Dave Filoni, where are you?
I can't possibly track everything that's going on.
Of course, yeah.
With the universe, because I wouldn't have time to do anything else.
Yeah.
But it's a direction that you could go with that. I've already expressed my feelings about the wills, which way I think that would have been nice.
They were pretty cool. I think that's where the whole "a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away" thing might come, is that they're observing that. And so maybe that's their...
That was always my feeling about that. I do want to mention the book.
Yes, please.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Jeez.
I have a book coming out from Centipede Press, hopefully next month, called The Director Should Have Shot You, which details my entire history, insofar as I can recall it, in doing film and TV adaptations into book form. You can write the publisher, again, that's Centipede Press. And a lot of questions that people have asked over the years get answered. A lot of questions they haven't asked get answered. And people who are curious about the process of writing film novelizations, or just about what it was like to work on everything from Aliens to the Chronicles of Riddick to Clash of the Titans to Black Hole, and of course Star Wars, might enjoy reading the book. It's not a terribly long book. It doesn't have a 200-page appendix, but
I'm gonna pick it up.
there's a lot of stuff in there that I've never talked about before, which occurred to me as I was writing the book. And it all starts with the first book adaptation I did, which is an adaptation of a terrible Italian film called Luana from 1973. And that's how I got started doing this.
Is there any little sneak peek from the book that you want to share with us? A little tease?
Other than what I've already said?
Yeah.
No, I mean, there are things in there like why I didn't write Alien Resurrection, the book version, after having written the previous 3 film adaptations. Why Vice President from Universal Studios called me and tried to ban me from having any contact with anyone related to the film The Chronicles of Riddick while I was working on the book. Why Alien 3 was such a bad experience. What can really go wrong when you're writing a novelization? Not destroy you as a writer, but to depress you. And things like Ray Harryhausen asking why he couldn't do a Lovecraft film, meeting H.R. Giger in a hallway outside a showing of the film at the LA Book, an ABA conference, and a lot of little things like that that I think people would enjoy. And of course, I'm ridiculously straightforward, as I usually am, and why nobody's going to ask me to write the next Star Wars film. And I don't I don't trash people. I don't do that. People are just people. But when something is wrong with the story, or when something is wrong with the film, I will always speak up. When I was doing the novelization of The Black Hole, afterwards I prepared a list of 75 things that I thought could be fixed or improved in post-production cheaply. And the story of what happened to that is in the book. So there's a lot. There's some fun stuff in there that I think people will enjoy reading.
We'll each have one last question. My final question for you, because I want to actually take this to heart, and I ask this to every writer that I meet. What's your mental discipline, your approach when you start getting hit with a little bit of that writer's block? Or does that never happen to you like Hemingway?
Never had writer's block. I'm sorry.
Right. Well, that's what Hemingway said too.
Never had writer's block. I've had situations where I work more slowly than other times, but I've never had writer's block. I have a little screen like this up in front of my face, imaginary screen, and all I do is describe what I'm seeing.
Oh, that's awesome.
I've been called a visual writer. That probably comes from learning how to read from comic books. And that's what I do. I just go to wherever the scene is and describe what I'm seeing.
It's beautiful. Thank you for
Cool.
that.
I don't have any further questions for you. You've been more than generous with your time. So we thank you for your time and for educating us and talking with us. And chat, thanks so much for being here.